Hello, I'm Sylvia Yount, Lawrence A. Fleischman Curator in charge of the Met's American Wing, and I'm thrilled to welcome you all to our final Met Speaks program, held in conjunction with the special exhibition, Jacob Lawrence, The American Struggle. Organized by the Peabody Essex Museum and co-curated in New York by myself and Randall Griffey, Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art, the exhibition is on view at the Met through November 1st, so there's still time to see it in person, especially if this virtual Zoom background isn't quite enough for you. A little-known series by the leading 20th century African-American artist, Lawrence's Struggle from the History of the American People consists of 30 12x16 tempera onboard panels painted between 1954 and 1956. Panels that explore the founding years of the United States through the lens of largely overlooked contributions and experiences of women and people of color, specifically Black and Indigenous Americans. Lawrence's prescient visual reckoning with this nation's complex history as inherently contested and diverse was radical painting for its time and remains deeply resonant for a host of reasons. Today, we are privileged to be able to listen in on a lively conversation between two eminent historians who have spent considerable time with Lawrence's series and bring distinctive perspectives to understanding its relevance then and now. Jill Lepore is the David Woods Kemper 41 Professor of American History at Harvard University. She is also the staff writer at The New Yorker and host of the podcast, The Last Archive. A prize-winning professor who has stated that, quote, writing history requires empathy, inquiry, and debate, she teaches classes in evidence, historical methods, humanistic inquiry, and American history. Much of her scholarship explores absences and asymmetries in the historical record, with a particular emphasis on the history and technology of evidence. As a wide-ranging and prolific essayist, Lepore writes about American history, law, literature, politics, as well as penetrating personal reflections. She is the author of many award-winning books, including the magisterial international bestseller, These Truths, A History of the United States, published in 2018. Her latest book, If Then, How the Simulmatics Corporation Invented the Future, is longlisted for the National Book Award. The Met's American Wing was lucky to host Dr. Lepore for a lecture back in 2016 while she was in the early stages of writing her epic, These Truths, so we are particularly excited to have her back with us today. In fact, pre-pandemic, we had arranged for her to deliver a more formal lecture on site at the Met on the Lawrence series, but once it became clear it would need to be via Zoom, we felt a virtual dialogue with another historian would be especially engaging. In those terms, I'm equally pleased to welcome Phillip J. Deloria of Dakota descent, who in 2018 became the Leverett Saltonstall Professor of History at Harvard. His prize-winning scholarship and teaching focus on the social, cultural, and political histories of the relations among American Indian peoples and the United States. He is the author of several books, including the classic Playing Indian, published in 1998, Indians in Unexpected Places from 2004, the 2017 American Studies, A User's Guide with Alexander Olson, and Becoming Mary Sully, Toward an American Indian Abstract, published just last year. Before joining Harvard's faculty in January 2018, Professor Deloria taught at the University of Colorado, then at the University of Michigan for many years, where he served as Associate Dean for Undergraduate Education and Director of Programs in both American Culture and Native American Studies. Deloria is a trustee of the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of the American Indian, where he chairs the Repatriation Committee. He is former president of the American Studies Association, an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the recipient of numerous prizes and recognitions, and in 2022 will serve as president of the Organization of American Historians. As a huge fan, it is such a tremendous pleasure to have both of these inspiring and prolific scholars with us today to reflect on the American struggle. And on behalf of the Met, I want to recognize the Jerome Levy Foundation for making this program possible in honor of Marvin Schwartz. Mr. Schwartz was a dedicated Met educator and beloved friend of the museum, and we are proud to honor his memory with thought-provoking conversations, such as we're about to hear. And with that, I give you Jill Lepore and Phil Deloria.
Thanks so much, Sylvia. It's really lovely to be here. I wish I were there in the room that you're in. I had the great pleasure of seeing this exhibit when it was at the Peabody. So I'm really grateful that I got to catch it there and not having been able to get to New York. And I'm so excited to get a chance to see Phil. We have adjacent offices on campus in a building that we have been barred from entering since March. So this is as close as we've been in all this time. It's super fun to, I usually get to hear Phil play his guitar through the wall that separates our office, and I miss that. So I'm going to kick us off. Sylvia had asked us not to prepare really a formal presentation. We really want to have a conversation. But I want to talk a little bit about, I want to talk a little bit about the sources that went into Lawrence's conception of American history at this moment. Why did he tell the story this way? Why did he picture it this way? In work that he began reading about in 1949 and began the work itself in 1954. So I think we all immediately call to mind the kind of signal events of that era. In 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court decision banning segregation in education. 1955, the Montgomery bus boycott, Emmett Till. So we could think about the kind of classic moment, the heyday of the classic era of the civil rights movement. But there's a lot of other 1950s context we could give to this work. And then I think what I want to begin with is the historical scholarship that most likely informed Lawrence's understanding of American history in this era, some of which has been pieced together by the curators, of course, thinking about and in the in the exhibit, in launching the exhibit itself, what Lawrence's sources were. I also want to mention that to me, the panel that really resonates is panel 15 on the Constitutional Convention. I have to confess that it's largely because it's just across the road from my office in the Harvard Art Museum. I take my students to see it all the time, and we have various assignments that they do trying to read this panel, and it's a completely different reading every time. It's just a very generative image. For my students, it's a very, they come to this picture, the Constitutional Convention as an idea. They picture kind of, a kind of John Trumbull-y veneration of these bewigged, knee-breeched guys. They think, I think to some degree about commemorative murals that have that kind of heroic, epic celebration of the learnedness and gentility of these really sort of aristocratic, very boring looking fellows. And then there's this dynamic, sharp, piercing, like poke you in the eye kind of a representation of what these sweaty, sort of ferocious, right? Like that ferocity of it is really interesting. So kind of one of the questions I have, and I don't really have the answer to this, where does that come from? This sense of the sort of, the swords are kind of laid down, but then the people themselves are very sword-like. So just to give a little bit of context for what Lawrence was up to, what he understood himself as being up to, he understood himself as taking on the project of telling the whole story of America, not just the story of Black people, which is what he had actually started out doing. In an earlier version of the project, he described it as a project to chart the history of the Negro people in the United States. And then he later revised that in a fellowship application. He said he instead had decided he wanted to write, or to depict a history of all the peoples who immigrated to the New World and contributed to the creation of the United States. One of the things that's interesting there, is the scope of that ambition, but also the emphasis on people, which we see in all of these images, right? It's a very people-centered account. In American history, there's kind of always been a divide between story of the nation and a story of the people. And those tend to map onto kind of a social history, which emphasizes people, and an intellectual history, which emphasizes the nation and the development of national ideas. So in many ways, Lawrence is most specifically drawing on the early social history of progressive era historians. He had read Charles and Mary Ritter Beard, whose classic 1927 book, The Rise of American Civilization, was really kind of the best-selling, maybe the sort of like equivalent to a kind of Howard Zinn account of him, like in terms of its popularity, right? Like as a kind of touchstone, people had read the Beards. But there were a lot of efforts in the 1930s to tell the story of the American people, right? There was a kind of documentary populism that we associated with work progress administration. So the photography projects, the storytelling and audio collecting projects generated a lot of similar accounts of the American people and the history of the American people that come out in the 1930s, sort of notably 1931, James Truslow Adams's Epic of America. a book that he wanted to call The American Dream, which was his coinage, and his editor said, "There is no American dream. What are you talking about? We're in the middle of a depression." But it was a fantastically popular account of American history, very people-centered. A lot of these stories were frankly Marxist in their approach. There was a federal radio America that was just a frankly Marxist account of American history, was kind of translation of Adams. So these are a little bit evanescent, but they're radio drama accounts that I suspect Lawrence heard as well. They're very, they're just scenes of people having these conversations, and that's how the story of America advances. These almost like panel-like. When I look at Sylvia, when I look at your back, it looks to me, like the Stations of the Cross, like in a church, we go and we stop at each of these stations. A lot of the radio dramas, which are episodic, right? The serial nature of radio drama led to this similar scene of the Stations of the Cross. So you have this thing, you have the emphasis on the people and peopling and people as a force in history, episodic approach to the telling of the story of American history. And then of course there are the great WPA mural projects as well. But that said, all of that retelling of the story of America in the 1930s as a story of peopling is in some significant contestation with a big debate about the Constitution. And that's why I want to emphasize panel 15. FDR's New Deal required a new constitutional interpretation and led to an extraordinarily extended battle with the Supreme Court over constitutional interpretation. A fairly conservative set of Supreme Court justices believed that the economic reforms that were part of FDR's New Deal violated the Constitution. They went beyond the powers of Congress allocated to Congress in the Constitution. This was what led to FDR's attempt to pack the court in 1937, which is very much resonant today. But that there came to be a kind of division in American political life in the 1930s. FDR's Assistant Attorney General wrote, "Hopeful people today wave the flag, timid people wave the Constitution." So there's something really interesting about Lawrence emphasizing the Constitution as an agent of change rather than the timid recourse to an objection to change. So Lawrence's approach is really buried in it. We can see that even in his Guggenheim application. He says the whole colonial series is going to depict class tyranny. So you see that social history, though, actually very challenged after the Second World War, where there's a real conservative reaction that's a kind of continuation of the argument about the Constitution, of course, right? Where a lot of this social history during the McCarthy era is all but prosecuted as communist, right? So the Federal Theater Project has been shut down by the House Un-American Activities Committee. I think that's in 1939, that's even before the war. But some of the stuff that's influencing Lawrence, like Herbert Aptheker's documentary history of the Negro people in the United States, which is a 7-volume documentary collection that comes out in 1951, Aptheker's been blacklisted as a communist. And so a lot of this work is being essentially run over by a kind of conservative reaction. It's useful marker to remember that in terms of thinking about the Stations of the Cross, the Boston Freedom Trail has its origins in 1951. And it's part of a conservative reaction to a kind of more Marxist interpretation of American history as essentially an economic struggle between the wealthy and the poor. In 1952, the Constitution was driven in an armored tank under military guard to the National Archives, where it remains today, and a shrine in the rotunda placed alongside the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights, ready to survive a nuclear apocalypse. Like this, the Constitution was not seen by people, it was not on display, it was not exhibited, it wasn't behind bulletproof glass. There's this real enshrining of the Constitution that's part of a kind of conservative reaction to the social history that we associate with the progressive era. What emerges in the 1950s, kind of in between these two poles, is what we think of as liberal consensus history, the kind of Richard Hofstadter, Arthur Schlesinger, Henry Steele Commager, a bunch of people who then are really interested in telling the story of America as an intellectual history, not necessarily as a conservative history, but as a history of liberalism. So spending a lot of time on the Constitution and the Constitutional Convention as intellectual historians, emphasizing the role of ideas over the role of people. So I would say, like, if we think about these different strands. I would add one more strand, which is civil rights discourse itself. So in 1955, when King was calling for the bus boycott in Montgomery, he wrote about the civil rights struggle. He wrote it into the story of the American people's struggle for freedom. So he said, if we were incarcerated behind the iron curtains of a communistic nation, we couldn't do this, that is, stage this protest. If we were trapped in the dungeon of a totalitarian regime, we couldn't do this. But the great glory of American democracy is the right to protest for right. This move that civil rights leaders made and that Lawrence is making here, which is to put the Black freedom struggle in the story as inseparable from the story of American liberty, a really crucial piece of the project. So I've kind of like looked at 5 different strains here: Beard Styles, Progressive Era Social History. There's John Hope Franklin's History of Black People, kind of this sort of specific social history version of that. The Intellectual History of the Constitution as the Origins of Modern Liberalism. A Conservative Reaction, which rejects all of these accounts and elevates the Constitution as sacred. And then Civil Rights Discourse that depicts the struggle, that struggle as a new American revolution. What all of these 5 strands share is a complete lack of attention to Indigenous peoples and to Native American history or American Indian history. Even as in the 1950s, the federal government was pursuing a new and yet more push to get Native people off reservations through what was called the Voluntary Relocation Program. Against that backdrop, that's not visible in any of these accounts. And if we think about that comes out of this era, that's in press for a long time. It's 1959, Carl Degler's Out of the Past, which is very much a story that is consistent with Lawrence's vision. It's a very much Black-white history of the United States. And Degler in his preface specifically says that he's left a lot out. He says, readers should be warned that they will find nothing here on the presidential administrations between 1868 and 1901. That's sort of a joke, like he's not going to attend to every presidency, and no mention of the American Indians. So there's where I want to turn this over to Phil.
Thanks, Jill. I mean, that's so interesting. I mean, you know this historiography so well, and it's, I have to say, so fun to have a colleague who's actually dared to write a synthesis of American history, because it does position you in all these really interesting ways to make cool connections. For me, historiographically, the thing that sort of jumped out a little bit was the sort of way in which Frederick Jackson Turner, right, who had sort of had a moment of ascendance around an argument around the frontier, but who was eclipsed, right, in the sort of 20s, 30s, 40s period by, folks like Walter Prescott Webb making an environmental argument, or Herbert Bolton making an argument about Spain and the South. But 1949, Ray Allen Billington writes, Westward Expansion, and this Howard Driggs book, which I don't know, Westward America, which is part of Lawrence's bibliography. So there's a kind of Westerny thing here, I think, that has a lot to do with sort of the place of Native peoples in, in the series. So, I mean, for me, the thing that's been super interesting, kind of like trying to systematically look through, the series is the ways that, history painting itself is this sort of like weird displacement of time, right? That like we're taken to the early American kind of context. We're asked to think about the Revolution and about the War of 1812. We're given a historical kind of reading of that, and we need to sort of engage with that. So it's about the past, but it's also, of course, about the moment in which the artist is making the work, Jill, as you pointed out, right? There's an intellectual kind of context in which Lawrence's thought actually takes shape, and in this case, the 1950s anti-Black violence, civil rights activism, kind of semi-breakdown of the political system in some ways. And then there's the third moment, which is now, the moment in which we engage historically, the artist, in his moment, who is engaging the moment of the past. And of course, the parallels here end up being so strong between the 50s and the present around anti-Black violence, protest and political, like literal political disintegration, in our own moment, that I think we're led to sort of make the parallels all the way back to the earlier moment as well. So struggle becomes this kind of critical transhistorical theme, in our own moment. And then, of course, if one actually believes that art has consequence, as I do, then we're also asked to contemplate a fourth temporality, which is the future, right? What will this art actually produce by being shown at this moment and asking us to, to evoke these, these different kinds of pasts. So it is, also interesting to me the way that Lawrence, as a historical thinker, is self-reflective about his own sort of transformation in the course of the project, right? Jill, as you mentioned, that, this started as something about African-American history and ended up being, a sort of what we're now framing as a kind of new and inclusive history, relative to that particular moment, of the American people, which ends up being sort of, centered, I think, around an immigration kind of narrative, right? In the ways that an African-American civil rights narrative and an immigration narrative actually dovetail, in interesting kinds of ways. So there's kind of a hint of a Lin-Manuel Miranda version of American history, right, where immigrants are in the room getting the job done and those kinds of things. But I think, as Jill, as you pointed out, when we name struggle as being an inclusive history or a more inclusive history, it's fair to ask just how inclusive it really is, or what kind of inclusion, right, it offers, and then to ask, where its blind spots might be and how we might think about those blind spots, in our moment. So, like you, I was of course struck by not just the absence of American Indian folks in this kind of conversation, but the presence of Native people in the panels. There are a lot of feathers, for example, here. And when you think about sort of Lawrence's palette, which favors all those kind of earth tones, blacks and browns, and, things with splashes of white, here and there, and a lot of red, of course, for blood, which is a, kind of obviously thematic thing in terms of struggle. The feathers are a fairly consistent sort of splash of color that cross a number of panels and take other shapes as well, in the peace panel, those flowers look an awful lot like the feathers that are adorning sort of, Native peoples. So it seems entirely possible to ask the question in this moment, how do Native people fit into a story of America? And so as I do that, I find myself being led into a kind of a baby series, right, within the larger series, and it's one thing to sort of just pull out every place where there's a sort of Native figure. But I think I found myself sort of pairing them up, and Jill, I kind of want to pitch them your way and see what you think, about these. So for me, this sort of little mini archive within an archive, would start with panels 2 and 3, Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party. Panels 18 and 22, Sacagawea and sort of Lewis and Clark on the one hand, and the Trappers on the other hand. This very interesting kind of panel, which shows, dead elk, who are actually, that's what trappers eat, but it's not what they trap, right? I mean, like, you don't trap elk. Panels 21 and 26, so Tecumseh and the Treaty of Ghent, ending the War of 1812. And then panels 5 and 27, the Petition of Many Slaves and the Georgia Slave Revolt. And then finally, panel 30, where old America breaks up and heads west and has this sort of westering kind of thing. And, of course, Lawrence didn't mean to end the series at that point, but it is where the series ends, And so I think when we're reviewing it, we do have to think of it as a kind of, not exactly closure, right? Because it's not a closure, it's a sort of opening, in some ways. And that's kind of consistent with that historiography, of the 50s in a lot of ways. And then I pair that back with panel 15, right? On the Constitution. And, for me, it's been really interesting sort of reading the catalog essay. One of the catalog essays has a sort of gesture to the clumps of these sweating, angular, pointed men sort of trying to figure it all out. And what they're figuring out is the 3/5 compromise, And so the clumps of 5 and 3 and 5 to add up to 13, and, whether one reads something out of that. But, of course, for me, the 3/5 clause, which, Jill, I don't know your experience, but my experience is like every one of our students knows the 3/5 clause, and you ask them like, hey, tell me about the 3/5 clause. And they're all like, oh, I know this one. And I got this one from AP, and their hands all go up. And, and of course, what they want to talk about is that very last phrase, 3/5. And what they never think about is the phrase that precedes it, which is, of course, Indians not taxed, which is carried forward into the, into the 14th, the 14th Amendment. So I was, lucky to write a small little meditation on the Boston Tea Party, panel. And here's what I said. I said, I wonder about the questions Lawrence might ask today, trying to sort of do this sort of temporal shifting a little bit. How could Black America better situate Indigenous people in the relation between Afrocentrism, right, and Lawrence's original sort of concept of this, maybe in a way, and the dream of American pluralism, right, his sort of second sense of it. And then there's, I think, a dialectical question that follows. How might Indian America understand its own legacies of slavery and anti-Blackness, right? Which you can't ask the first question without asking the second question, right? placed in dialogue? Might the two have something new to say? To immigrant America, that other thing, right? Offering a different vision of the struggle to build a humane, and democratic nation. So I think what's fascinating about the series is, of course, that Jacob Lawrence is stuck with the blind spots, of that moment. But as you pointed out, Jill, right, the termination policy, starts in 1953 to actually once again tear apart Native American political identities and polities and collectivities, relocation policy to sort of take Native people, away from their tribal communities and move them into cities. Sylvia's been quite generous in sharing with us a lot of the critical accounts of this. In not one critical account have I heard anyone sort of mention, this other kind of context. So in a way, Lawrence's Indians are sort of cardboard cutouts, right, in this sort of story of American westerning, and I think we gotta admit that, But on the other hand, I mean, he was an artist, right? And I want to give artists credit where, credit is due. He's not just, he's technical master, right? I mean, there's a lot of sort of stuff about like, this is Lawrence at his sort of high watermark, as an artist. And it's not just about that he's a historically inclined person who was doing research, right? Doing research to really make these things go. But, I think artists also have to operate on intuition and openness and the understanding that the art will possess its own sort of magic, right? Across time. And in that sense, I kind of want to give him, open it up back to giving him credit on this. Wondering if it's not also right to sort of think that he was sensing something, right? A kind of structure of feeling that had not quite yet been perceived or precipitated, in that moment, right? In which these Native American, African American stories were possible, and in which it was possible to sort of imagine them together and to maybe make them central, in American history. So Lawrence isn't quite able to do that, but I think struggle in some ways gives us the content for us to think about it and, and to do it. This is sort of, I mean, it's been really fascinating for me to sort of like try to sit down systematically. I haven't taught with this, with any of these images, although I think I'm going to in the future. This is the great virtue for me of having Jill Lepore in my office next door, is I learn, so many cool tricks, and I learn so much about what's on campus at Harvard. So I'll be making the pilgrimage over to the, to the art museum, as well. I mean, Jill, maybe it makes sense for me to sort of pitch it back to you and ask maybe a bit more about sort of how that panel or that image actually shows up, like what are some of the diverse things that students say about it? Does the panel open up stuff that becomes, unexpected? Does it ever open up to Native kinds of questions, I guess? Have you ever had a student do the move that, like, I've just criticized the critics for not making? Has ever done it?
That's a really interesting question. It's funny what you say. I just want to underscore what you say about the 3/5 clause. In my U.S. History Survey class last week, the debate was over L.B. Wilkins, which is an 1884 Supreme Court case. It's a 14th Amendment case about Native citizenship. And it all turns on Indians not taxed. And our discussion was largely students saying, like, what the hell is that? like they had never heard it before. And it was really revelatory. It was a really interesting conversation. But I think their familiarity with that larger trajectory, the constitutional trajectory of Native citizenship and Native rights claims, it's Lawrence's set of blind spots is not very far from our own. I think that's actually a really interesting observation to make. It is a very long time ago for that set of constitutional questions to not be part of our public memory, public debate, and this in the way that we so urgently talk about racial justice in the Black Lives Matter context. So that comparison, I think, is worth thinking about, and not as a way to be dismissive of this series of works, but as a way to be reflective on what's happened since then. With the panel 15, so I'm a faculty member on a team taught course where we have the great benefit of teaching in the art museum. You can reserve a seminar room in the incredibly beautiful top tier of the building. And then what I do is, for each week's reading, I assign a pair of students to find something in the museum that we must all go see that helps us to understand this work of literature. So we start with the Odyssey, and they inevitably find the Greek vase, and we all clomp down the stairs and go look at the Greek vase. But the first time I ever saw this Lawrence panel, I didn't know it was there either, was when we were reading the Federalist Papers. And a pair of students said, oh yeah, we found the thing, the one really important thing. And we walked down the 5 flights of stairs into the gallery on the first floor. And there it was, and it kind of leapt off the wall at us, because really, again, it just sort of shook up their understanding of what political contest looks like. And so I don't know, I mean, this is a way in which I just have a deep cherishing of that, which it displays the urgency of confronting one another. I mean, and that's, I guess, just to think about, you know, what you say about the feathers everywhere, or the, like, there's a kind of ongoing presence of different sorts of people within these frames, and they're generally faces that are quite intimately confronting one another. There's a face-to-face quality to all of these interactions. Maybe that just strikes me because look at our faces here, like we're thousands of miles away from one another. Like we are not faced, like this is not that. What does it mean to, you know, smell your breath, the breath of the person that you're arguing with? That, I think, there's a kind of longing for that, that I have in this particular political moment. I like what the struggle is not afraid of facing people that you might disagree with, right? So in terms of what we carry down to our day, that seems really important to me. Yeah, I guess just, you know, paging through the catalog again, that's what I was really struck by, the angularity and intimacy, and the anger of so many of these faces. And I get that, so in so many ways they are caricatures, but they do have a kind of almost like religious iconography to me. That's why I kind of go back to the Stations of the Cross. Like they are, this is a signal, this is an allegorical moment. Here's another allegorical moment. Let's go to this one, less than it is, you know, specific characters holding ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I'm struck in looking at these, how often faces are very, very close to one another. How teeth sort of jump out of faces in a way that, like, you know, the faces are very sort of stylized and angular and cubist in a lot of ways. And then you turn around and you get these little teeth that are sticking out, and it really takes the face into sort of like almost a kind of skull-like sort of dimension, right? So it's like bodies close to bodies, faces close to faces, arms to arms, fists to fists, right? So often, right? Weapons to weapons. You know, this sort of sense of like his interest in like having weapons piercing bodies all the time, right? There's always a knife sticking through someone's, you know, kind of body or you know, or about to. I have to say, I mean, just in terms of sort of the visual sort of practice of this, I had this very interesting kind of moment in sort of looking at these, where I was taken to some of the pictorial conventions of like Native American ledger drawings, right? Where when someone is dying, like, you know, when there's a bullet, you know, there is like a big spurt of blood that comes out. And a lot of times it kind of looks, it's gushing, you know, and when people are like, horses are dying in the, with the elk and the trappers, there's another one where there's a dying horse, right? Blood that's literally coming out of the mouth. I mean, it's just interestingly sort of pictorial conventions in some, you know, Native American, you know, kind of drawing in the 19th century. I would not make the connection, you know, the direct historical connection there, but it is interesting, you know, when we start juxtaposing imagery and the way that it works and functions. I mean, one of the things that I've always thought about those pictographic kinds of drawings is that they also displace time, right, in ways that Lawrence is pretty willing to displace time within the images, and certainly between the images and the quotations. I mean, I was completely befuddled with the Tecumseh panel, right, where he has sort of Tecumseh's sort of like, this is our last ditch kind of deal, and he's trying to rally the British, you know, and he places that back 2 years earlier in Tippecanoe, right? So that it's like, no, that's not what Tecumseh would have said back then. That's just not really right. So he's, and of course, I think Lawrence has to know that, right? So he's willing to get us playing. He's willing to displace time, you know, and temporality in the images you know, themselves.
It's so interesting. I love the Native American ledger idea, because I see, you know, this is because I once wrote a book about Wonder Woman. I see the comic book panel, right? The kaboom panel, the Batman bashing, you know, the one violent gesture that crosses the frame. I'm trying to use my Zoom frame in a creative way. It speaks to me of that kind of pop art version of storytelling, what action you can fit in a frame. So, but it is really interesting, though. I wonder what we think about the centrality of violence to the story of struggle, right? So to the Constitution, like it almost looks like there must be violence going on here, except there's not quite. We still have to see the swords, but it still has a kind of violent capacity in it. And I wonder, that made me wonder a little bit about what you were saying about the scholarship and of course, deep popular interest in the West. And in kind of the notion, you know, because the 50s is when Arthur Schlesinger is writing The Age of Jackson, and it's kind of got a neo-Turnerian argument, right? That like democracy comes from the West. It's the violent clash between savagery and civilization in the West that makes possible democracy in the East. Like it's a general, Frederick Jackson Turner, the historian, writes in 1893, and Arthur Schlesinger kind of resurrects that in a certain way. So I wonder if there's some piece of Lawrence thinking in those terms, that like you have to show these people not just in dialogue or struggling for something, but clashing, and it is in that clash that emerges this force of the idea of America. Or so, I don't know. How do you understand the centrality of violence here?
I mean, that feels right to me. I mean, I think it is definitely, there's this kind of new Turnerian sort of moment, right, in the 50s, you know, with, you know, Billington is so clearly kind of like, I'm going to recapture, you know, the magic of Turner, you know, and it's done in a kind of misty, golden, Bierstadian kind of haze, right, of, you know, pioneers kind of happily moving across, you know, but it's also got that kind of Rooseveltian kind of deal, like we became a nation by, you know, our manly conflict with a, you know, a dangerous rival, and when we overcame those Indians, you know, that was, I mean, that's sort of the, you know, Rooseveltian. So there's a kind of weird thing I think that's happening, you know, it's intersecting, you know, around those. It's also worth noting that it is kind of the moment of American studies, right? That, you know, Julie, both of you and I, you know, come to history out of an American studies context, right? Where we've got Henry Nash Smith and, you know, folks like this who are trying to think about American synthesis, you know, at the same time. You know, and in that sense, right, the sort of foregrounding of violence, you know, feels quite radical, right? I mean, because one of the things that happens in a lot of that literature is violence is really quite displaced. You know, so for him to restore that and to make it so visceral, you know, that does feel like an important kind of intervention, right, that he's making.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think the other thing about that American Studies moment that, as you mentioned, that recalls to me, just to go back to something you said earlier, is the political importance of the story of America as the story of a nation of immigrants, which will become the title of John Kennedy's, what is it, 1959 book, that as a kind of Cold War account of the United States becomes really important in the 1950s, sort of that Oscar Handlin, like The Uprooted is published in that decade. Let's reject this earlier account of kind of the Anglo-Saxon greatness of America. There's a whole historiography from the 19th century that these young, especially a lot of Jewish intellectuals, are rejecting, and rewriting the story of America as the story of immigrants. There's a project in the 1930s called Americans All, Immigrants All. That's another radio series that's sponsored by FDR's WPA. Each week of the radio series looks at a different immigrant group, although there's a week on the Negro as well. Du Bois serves and Alan Locke both serve as consultants for that project. I don't believe there is a week on Native people. It's just like the Americans All, Immigrants All story, which is crucial to kind of both countering Nazi Germany, but then also countering the Soviet Union, becomes really important as a kind of popular, at the popular level. So I think we could situate Lawrence's story within that, but then, as you say, like all the violence in that is not part of that story. That is a story about my grandfather stopped at Ellis Island, and then he ran. He had a penny in his pocket, but he got his job as a newspaper hawker, and then he had a shop, and now now I'm at CUNY. Like that's kind of the story. So what is the? That's not a story of violence. So yeah, it's hard to kind of situate both, like what seems to be expressed in Lawrence that is a distillation of so much else that's going on, and what is the kind of the shock of the novelty of the depiction here.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, right? Because I mean, it's I mean, by the 60s, right? I mean, as you have sort of Black Power movements and sort of the academic wing, ethnic studies, right? Lawrence is seen to be sort of like not in tune with, with the times. but here he's clearly not in the place of that earlier ethnic studies, which is to say, like, we will study the Irish, we will study Jewish immigration, we will study Italians, right? We will white ethnic kind of, ethnic studies as it was, configured, earlier. He's clearly, drawing on that, but also I think like he's not wholly subsumed by that, right? He's outside the boundaries. The African-American sort of dimension of it, I think, doesn't let you necessarily just live comfortably, within that space. And of course, my dream always is that, what might it have looked like for there to have been, another kind of, or a deeper kind of engagement, around Native stuff. And, and this is where, some of these images just really, really jump out at me as sort of like, if I could go back and talk to Jacob Lawrence, I'd say, well, let's do that Boston Massacre thing. And before you do it, let's just say a few Massachusetts place names and get them in our head, right? So let's say like Nantucket and Wampatuck and Congamuck and Menankesuk and Naugatuck and Peck, and then now let's say Crispus Attucks, right? It's like, oh, damn, right? He's a Wampanoag guy, right? And it's not like it's hidden. It's in his name, right? I mean, it is right there. And, so what's interesting then there is the sort of way in which, Lawrence is right there in the midst of the larger currents of Native erasure, right? Of like Native people can be sitting right in front of you and like they're just going to be erased. Even when we say Crispus Attucks was multiracial, had a multiracial background, right? He stays black, right? And partly he stays black because he's a fugitive slave. And that, of course, sort of then takes us away from all the possibilities of indigenous folks being, also, appearing as slaves, Or I think about, the Jefferson, the Sacagawea kind of image, which is also, I think, super, super evocative. And some of the readings of this really have been sort of like, there's a centrality, right, of this sort of red robe of Sacagawea and the blue robe of her brother and this kind of heart-shaped reunion that's bringing these two people together. And of course, like, this is the story of an enslaved person, right, who has been ripped from her family, who is now being reunited, right? The dream, right, of African-American enslaved people who saw their families torn asunder and sort of could only dream of the reunion. So there are embedded within all of these things, the possibilities, right, for us to read, I think, in this moment, for us to read out other kinds of histories that are very, very connected, right, that allow us to connect these stories, up. And of course, there's other ones too, but, I'm not going to sit here and do image after image, kind of readings, but.
Yeah, I could listen to you talk about the images all day. So, but I guess what I wanted to ask, just kind of in the spirit of Sylvia's initial framing of the conversation, what about today, right? What about, thinking about the kind of continuation of the history wars, or kind of people trying to kind of resurrect the history wars? So just for people that haven't followed this, in the 1990s, historians talk about these history wars that were largely over national history standards, which Gary Nash, who was at UCLA, had, I think, chaired a commission to devise national history standards. And he's a social historian. The standards that he developed were inclusive of social history of the day, very much of their moment. They were rejected by critics on the right. I think that Lynn Cheney was among those people who was, I think, at the head of the NEH at the time, rejected those, we should be learning about Jefferson and Madison and Lincoln and Wilson, and not about Harriet Tubman. And, that's a sort of the version of that account. This is a battle that goes on and on and on and on and on. They're just skirmishes after skirmish. Lawrence's work wasn't in particular way engaged in that kind of a battle at the time that he undertook this work, although we might wonder why he didn't finish the project, which was supposed to go all the way down to armistice, to the end of the First World War. But what to you is the importance of this exhibit in this moment today, or as part of this conversation about what we know and what we study about the story of the United States?
I mean, it's really interesting, as Sylvia was asking us to think a bit about this, right, Jill, she invoked sort of that we're in the ByPOC moment, right, that this sort of emergent term for getting us to think about, the unevennesses between sort of various folks who fall into the category of people of color, anti-Black racism as a separate kind of formation, white supremacy as a separate kind of formation. And, for me, the question is always like, what's the I, how is the I going to be sort of navigated in this particular moment? Because it feels like a pretty slender letter, to me, in regard to, our contemporary conversations, right? It's a letter that's getting a little bit more robust, right? And that's really, quite interesting and important, I think, but how one makes that happen. And you've thought, about how one does a synthetic narrative history of the United States, right? I mean, and I remember quite well, sort of the roundtable around these truths at the Organization of American Historians thing, where person after person sort of stood up and said, well, and you didn't say anything about this, and you didn't say anything about that, and you were quite generous until one moment we were like, look, you think it's easy? You try it, right? And see what happens when you are in the position of making kinds of decisions, around what will be central, to a narrative. I mean, that feels like that's what's really at stake, right? Who gets to decide what is central in what narrative and how it gets told? And is it enough to sort of say, like, we've just got a whole bunch of competing narratives, right? Has that gotten us into a useful place, right? Or is it to say, like, well, here's a bigger, broader, kind of more expanded narrative in which we can find some kind of agreement. I mean, this to me in some ways feels like, I mean, Jill, you should correct me if I'm wrong, but this is kind of at the heart of your intellectual project, right? Is it important and useful for us to imagine commonality around narrative, given the impossibility, right, of ever having a narrative that will satisfy, everyone? What does it look like to bring in as many people as possible? That feels like that was the direction Lawrence was heading, right? With that was his impulse here, and to me it's pretty interesting. It's what makes this so important relative to, like, say, the migration series, which is beautiful and brilliant and acclaimed in all kinds of ways, right? But this is a move, and in that way, it feels to me like he's modeling a move. It's imperfect, of course, as it'll always be. There's no utopian narrative here, right? But he's modeling for us a way to sort of think about these things. And for me, that means like saying, okay, you want to talk about Washington? Let's talk about him as the single largest American land speculator who's making his money off Indian land. You want to talk about Abraham Lincoln? Let's talk about the hanging of the Dakota 38. And let's talk about the war, the Civil War that was waged in the West during the Civil War that we just kind of forgot about, which is a massive war of native dispossession. I mean, it's not that hard, right, to start wedging these things in to expand the story, it doesn't seem like to me.
Yeah, although I think, a challenge that you have often given to me, which I find really hard to answer, is you can see the ways in which white immigrant groups and descendants of enslaved people are comfortable writing their history into a larger story of American history as a struggle for freedom. And for the independence and sovereignty of the nation and the nation state. But Indigenous history doesn't fit into that narrative. Like, there isn't a buy-in of like, oh, that's our story too, thanks a lot, just put us in every chapter, right? Like that doesn't work. And it put us in every panel, we'll just be there, hi, like, we're the letter I. Like, that doesn't, like, I get, that's your critique. Like, if there's a plot, right? There's a plot to American history. We try to be free and extend freedom to more peoples over time, right? You can contort a lot of different groups, Asian Americans, Mexican, for all of the atrocity and Japanese internment and Mexican deportation, like Chinese exclusion, like we can still say getting better and better. Like, we could still try to say that. I mean, maybe at the moment we can't, but like we're off a cliff now. But what's the plot line of this, the story of the many Indigenous peoples in what becomes the United States over time? You can't wrestle that in. So Lawrence couldn't do that, but I've been deeply criticized for failing to do that myself, and I think the criticism is fair. So what's the solution, though? Because this is maybe where we disagree. Like, I still think it's useful, because if scholars don't try to figure that out, then we have the 1776 project, and we're kind of back to with a freedom trail, and it's 1951 and the height of the Cold War.
No, I don't think we disagree at all, Jill. I'm actually totally with you on sort of thinking, like, what is the project, or like, what is the narrative project that allows us to get past that thing, right? That thing of settler colonialism, right? I mean, is there a way? It's a totally open and unanswered question, I think. But it goes straight back to the Constitution. I mean, I think it is really panel 15 really is so important, right? It goes back to the Constitution, because if you say Indians not taxed, what does that imply? It implies two things, right? One is that like you could be taxed as an Indian. So there is this moment in the Constitution which sort of says, yeah, you could leave your tribal citizenship and sort of join in that other narrative, right? That other narrative. At the same time, it sits parallel that like there is a distinctiveness to Native nations, which is going to be sitting alongside all of those American narratives. And maybe it is that there's a kind of parallel, there's a sort of parallel exception for Native stuff in the midst of this big and broad sort of expanding, American narrative. I haven't solved the problem either, and of course, what ends up happening in American history is that these things become bifurcated and become, they get increasingly crazy because they're subdivided and moved along. Oh, it's domestic. No, it's foreign. No, it's domestic dependent. No, it's right. And all of a sudden, you've got like sovereignty still ongoing, not granted, but residual and retained. At the same time, you've got trust related. So it gets very, very complicated. And yet we all are here. Right? In some way, we have to like imagine how we account for the fact that we are all here.
Thank you, Jill and Phil, for that extraordinarily penetrating reflection on this series. I know we're all going to look at these panels in very different ways, and so much to think about just for the days ahead. Thank you so much.